In the previous video, we took a look at all of the cultural offerings of the Eden Center, which is a Vietnamese retail district just outside Washington, D.C. In this video, we're going to examine whether or not it truly is the nexus of the Vietnamese population in the D.C. area. So here I've pulled up a visual that I created using Paint that shows the census tracts in the D.C. area that are over 10% Vietnamese, as well as the census tract in which the Eden Center is actually located. Here's the Eden Center. It's marked by the star. The census tract in which it's located is actually only 0.2% Vietnamese and has an estimated 8 Vietnamese people as of the 2008 to 2012 American Community Survey 5-year estimates, and that's actually where all the data in this video are obtained. The closest census tract with any sizable Vietnamese population is 12.4% Vietnamese, but remember it's also 48.1% Hispanic. So the Vietnamese are really a drop in the bucket compared to the Hispanic population, and that tract has about 366 Vietnamese people. But remember here that there are quite a few other tracts that are more Vietnamese than that census tract. For example, this census tract here in Annandale is 16% Vietnamese and 27.5% Hispanic. So you can look at this Vietnamese to Hispanic ratio and you'll see that the Vietnamese have a stronger presence relative to the Hispanics than they do in this tract, which is abutting the Eden Center. Another example is this tract just nearby the one we just took a look at, also in Annandale. It's 17.6% Vietnamese, 11.2% Black, 9.4% Hispanic, and 6% Korean. This one has 877 Vietnamese people, that's the estimate. And that's over twice as many people as this tract closest to the Eden Center. And remember, the one in which the Eden Center is actually located only has 8 Vietnamese people. And its largest minority group is Indian, and they comprise 5.1% of the tract's population versus 0.2% for Vietnamese. So this tract here in Annandale, it's the tract in the DC area where the Vietnamese comprise the largest share of the total population, as well as the largest share of the minority populations. About 55% of this census tract here is non-Hispanic white, and the Vietnamese comprise about a third of that 55%. And here I've marked a couple census tracts in Springfield, Virginia that are over 10% Vietnamese. And here's one in North Springfield. And this is actually the tract with the most Vietnamese people in absolute numbers in the DC area. Now I've added to the map a star, or actually a 4-pointed star, which marks the center of the Koreatown district in Annandale. And what you'll notice here is that the two most heavily Vietnamese census tracts actually abut the Koreatown district in Annandale. And this one in particular is 17.6% Vietnamese while only being 6% Korean. So on the actual census tract map, these were the two districts that were 17.6 Vietnamese and 16.3% Vietnamese respectively. And this is the center of the Koreatown retail district. And I pulled up a street view here. This intersection of Columbia Pike and Little River Turnpike. You can see it here. Annandale Road coming off northwest from Little River Turnpike. Again, you can see Annandale Road here. Well, you look at the shopping center that we're facing and you'll see all the signs are in Korean, so it is clearly a Korean retail district. Now what's interesting is that in the two census tracts abutting the district, the Vietnamese significantly outnumber the Koreans. Again, here are those tracts here. In this tract, the Korean population doesn't even crack 5%. So on the previous map, I left out one other census tract in the DC area that's over 10% Vietnamese. So I've zoomed out and included it here. It didn't fit on the previous map. And this star here still marks the location of the Eden Center. So this tract is located in Centerville, Virginia, and it's outlined here in black. It's 14.4% Vietnamese, 13.9% Chinese, 6.5% Indian, 5.6% Korean, and 9.5% Hispanic, and has a total of 481 Vietnamese people as of the 2008 to 2012 American Community Survey estimates. What's interesting is this area is actually, like the town of Centerville is actually a burgeoning new Koreatown. So many of the Korean businesses that were located in Annandale, the Koreatown that we took a look at earlier in the video, it's further east, a lot of them opened up secondary branches in Centerville to service a growing Korean population in the area. But you'll notice in this census tract, the Vietnamese outnumber the Koreans over 2.5 to 1. So if you add the numbers up, all of the tracts we took a look at that were over 10% Vietnamese, so the 5 on this map, remember this is not one of the tracts that's over 10% Vietnamese, it's the census tract in which the Eden Center is located. But it's not one that's over 10% Vietnamese, it's actually 0.2% Vietnamese. But if you add up the Vietnamese populations of the tracts that are over 10% Vietnamese, so the 6 shown here, as well as the one in Centerville on the other map, you'll get a total Vietnamese population of 4,622. Now I've pulled up some data from the American Community Survey to give you an idea how concentrated the Vietnamese population is. So we said there are 4,622 Vietnamese in the DC area who reside in census tracts that are over 10% Vietnamese. All of those tracts are in Fairfax County, Virginia. Now Fairfax County, Virginia has 29,804 Vietnamese people. So out of the 29,804 Vietnamese residing in Fairfax County, Virginia, only 4,622 reside in census tracts that are over 10% Vietnamese. Means the remaining, 25,200 or so reside in tracts that are under 10% Vietnamese. And Fairfax County, Virginia only contains 29,804 of the Vietnamese people out of the 62,601 who reside in the Washington area. So really only 4,622 Vietnamese people out of the 62,601 reside in tracts that are over 10% Vietnamese. So you can tell the Vietnamese population is quite dispersed. And the census tracts immediately abutting the Vietnamese retail district of the DC area, which is the Eden Center, only have a total of 8 plus 366 Vietnamese people. So that is 374 out of 62,601 total Vietnamese people in the DC area. So while the Eden Center might be somewhat of a hub for Vietnamese retail, it's not at all a hub for the Vietnamese population as far as residential patterns are concerned. So I have to make a note about margins of error for data on these census tracts we took a look at. Remember that census tracts are very small geographical entities, so the most Vietnamese census tract in the DC area only has 1,534 total people. And that's actually an estimate of its population, and that estimate was derived from the 2008 to 2012 American Community Survey 5-year estimates. The corresponding estimate for the Fairfax County population was 190,824. Now next to these estimates you can see there's a column that says margin of error. You can see here for the census tract 452-101 in Fairfax County, which is the most Vietnamese census tract in the DC area, this estimate of the population for that census tract has a margin of error of 660. What this means is that there is a 95% chance that the true number of people residing in this census tract lies between 1,534 minus 660 and 1,534 plus 660. So that means that there's a 95% chance that the true population of that census tract lies anywhere between 874 and 2,194. You can see that's a pretty big range. And given the small size of the estimate itself, which is the sample size here, that amount of variability is quite massive. In fact, 660 is 43% of the sample estimate itself. Now let's look at the margin of error for the Fairfax County population. The margin of error for the Fairfax County population is plus or minus 1,706. So that means there's a 95% chance that the true population of Fairfax County during this time interval, 2008 to 2012, lied somewhere between 189,118 and 192,530. And the reason I said 95% chance is that most of these margins of error utilize what's called a 95% confidence interval. So why do I bother mentioning that? Well, if you look at some numbers that constitute really, really small sample sizes, you can actually see that the margin of error can be bigger than the estimate. For example, the estimate for the Filipino population in Census Tract 452-101 in Fairfax County is 95. The margin of error is plus or minus 109. So there's a 95% chance that it can range anywhere from -14 to 204. Or at least that's what the margin of error calculation tells us. And that's how this should be interpreted. Obviously, you can't have -14 people. So some of these numbers from a purely statistical point don't have a ton of validity. For example, the Vietnamese population in the census tract 452-101 in Fairfax County, which is the tract that per this estimate has the highest share of Vietnamese in the DC area, that population could theoretically be only 226, while the census tract's Chinese population could theoretically be 230 people. So even though the Vietnamese estimate is 877 and the Chinese estimate is 124, there's a 95% chance that the Vietnamese population ranges anywhere from 877 minus 651 to 877 plus 651. And at the low end, that's 226. At the upper end, the Chinese population is 124 plus 106. So at the upper end of that interval, you'll have a Chinese population of 230, which is bigger than the Vietnamese population. However, in all of my observations, when I've actually visited businesses that have a local catchment area, and what I mean by local catchment areas is, consider a Walmart is a business that's going to have a larger catchment area because there's not necessarily a Walmart in every little census tract or small suburb. So you'll have people coming from nearby areas to the Walmart, so the people you see at that Walmart may not actually reside in that particular suburb. But if you go to a local tire shop or a small pocket park, those types of establishments, well, I don't know if a park's an establishment, but those types of areas can pretty much be found in virtually every census tract. So it's not likely that someone from a census tract far away is going to travel to a tire shop in, say this census tract we're looking at here. But what I've noticed is from traveling to a lot of these census tracts, the proportions of people you see largely fall in line with these estimates. So even though theoretically the Chinese population could be bigger than the Vietnamese population in this census tract, my observations have indicated that the Vietnamese far outnumber the Chinese in this particular census tract. And at these estimates, the ratio of estimates can be used as a good indicator to understanding the relative presences of various groups in a particular census tract. Of course, the larger the geographical area, the smaller the margin of error becomes relative to the estimate. So you can see relative to the estimate here, the Chinese population in this census tract is 106 relative to 124. Whereas when you're looking at Fairfax County as a whole, the margin of error in the Chinese population is 1,705, while the estimate is 26,903. So 1,705 is a much smaller share of 26,903 than 106 is of 124. If that confused you, don't worry about it. I'm just saying from a purely statistical standpoint, some of my arguments may be a bit flawed, but a lot of the numerical arguments that I'm making actually do pan out from an observational standpoint. In this video, we briefly mentioned the Koreatown retail district in Annandale and noted that it actually had a larger Vietnamese population than a Korean population. In a future video, we'll take a look at some of the cultural and retail offerings of this Koreatown district in Annandale.